September 19th, 1944. Arnhem, the Netherlands. This city looked more like a slaughterhouse on fire. Inside the ruins of a red miners' brick building in the town center, a few British paratroopers huddled in a dust miners' choke corner. Their faces were blackened by soot-like ghosts, their lips cracked and bleeding from 3 days without water. Above them, outside the shattered window, came a sound that froze the soul, the screech of metal tracks crushing cobblestone. A young paratrooper trembled as he peeked over the windowsill. Less than 20 meters away, a behemoth was rotating its turret. It was not the horse miners' drawn cart intelligence had promised. It was not a supplied ruck. It was a 50-6-ton Tiger tank. The massive 80-8mm cannon slowly elevated, its dark muzzle pointing directly at the second miner's floor window. Instinctively, the paratrooper raised his weapon, a Sten submachine gun, a weapon firing 9mm pistol rounds. Against the steel hide of the German monster, the gun in his hands was nothing more than a pea shooter. It was an absurd duel. Boom! A single deafening crack. The tank's cannon spewed a ball of fire. The entire wall disintegrated in an instant. The massive shockwave pulverized furniture and floorboards into splinters. Bricks flew like shrapnel, and a cloud of choking dust swallowed everything. This was not a battle. This was an execution. In the final moments, the minds of these soldiers might have flashed back to the promise made by their commanders. The Germans are finished. There are only old men left. How were elite paratroopers dropped into a nest of SS Panzer Division? To solve this riddle that sent 30,000 men into the abyss, we must rewind the clock 72 hours. Back to that sunny, ultimately cursed Sunday. September 17th, 1944. On the airfields of Lincolnshire, the autumn sun spilled gently onto the damp grass. For the 10,000 soldiers of the British 1st Airborne Division gathering on the runways, the day carried little scent of impending doom. The air was thick with aromas, the sharp sting of high-octane aviation fuel, and the metallic tang of freshly oiled guns, and the comforting smell of strong tea brewed to settle nerves. It did not look like the prelude to a slaughter. It looked more like a grand regatta. Under the wings of the giant C-47 transport planes and the wooden Horse gliders, soldiers went through their final equipment checks. Young paratroopers tightened the straps of their chutes and polished their Sten guns. Inside their packs, they stuffed chocolate bars and comic books. Officers gathered in loose circles, placing bets on who would drink the first pint of beer in a downtown Arnhem pub. This relaxation was born of absolute confidence. In the final briefings, a message from Field Marshal Montgomery was unequivocal. It was a message that filtered down to the lowest private. The Germans are finished. They are no longer a cohesive army. According to the Supreme Allied Command, the forces remaining in Holland were merely a rabble of terrified stragglers. The panzer divisions that had once terrorized Poland and France were gone, evaporated in the heat of Normandy. What remained in the Netherlands, they were told, were merely logistical units, old men, and battalions composed of the infirm. In the vivid descriptions given by commanders, Operation Market Garden was painted not as a battle, but as a victory parade. The mission of the 1st Airborne was simple: drop from the sky, seize bridges, accept flowers, and wait for the armored column. Everyone believed the war would be over by Christmas. They believed they were the heroes who would deliver the final blow. However, just outside this bubble of optimism, a desperate gamble involving life and death had already been played and lost. Major Urquhart, the intelligence officer, had locked himself in a dark room smelling of acidic developer fluid. On his desk lay aerial reconnaissance photos taken by Spitfires that risked death to skim low over the Dutch countryside. Urquhart was glued to a magnifying glass, his breathing rapid, sweat dripping from his forehead onto the photo paper. He was looking for the source of annoying fear, because according to High Command, Arnhem was an undefended vacuum. But through the high-power lens, deep in the shadows of the woods northeast of the Arnhem Bridge, he saw suspicious shapes. Through the gaps in what looked like natural shrubbery, Urquhart saw cold geometric shapes that made his blood freeze. They were not trucks or horse-drawn carts. The rectangular steel hulls were the unmistakable signatures of heavy armor. As he cross-referenced photo after photo, a terrifying truth emerged from the grain. Hiding in the forests were not old men. Hiding in the Arnhem forests were the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, specifically the 9th Hohenstaufen and the 10th Erfurensburg. These were the most ruthless, battle-hardened elite units of the Third Reich, although they had been mauled in Normandy. A Tiger is still a tiger. Their Tiger tanks and veteran grenadiers were more than enough to tear light infantry to shreds. Urquhart saw the catastrophe. He rushed to General Browning, waving the photos, his voice trembling with absolute terror. He pointed to the Panther turrets, pleading that dropping paratroopers into a tank sanctuary was nothing short of murder. But the response was icy. General Browning, desperate to etch his name in history, refused to even look at the photos. He did not want to counsel a magnificent operation involving thousands of aircraft based on what he saw as a few blurry images. He coldly dismissed the evidence suggesting the tanks were wrecks and accused the intelligence officer of being hysterical. The intelligence that could have saved 30,000 lives was ignored. Major Urquhart was placed on mandatory sick leave. Hours later, as the roar of engines filled the sky, the tragedy was sealed. They were dead men before they touched the ground. At 1 in the afternoon, the operation began. It was perhaps the most spectacular visual spectacle in the history of warfare. From the ground, the sky was blotted out. The C-47 Armada moved like birds, towing the massive wooden gliders. Thousands of white and camouflage parachutes bloomed in the azure Dutch sky, drifting down like dandelion seeds in the wind. The first phase of the landing was disturbingly smooth. Soldiers touched down on the soft grass and turn of fields west of Arnhem. Dutch villagers ran out from cellars, waving orange flags, offering apples and fresh milk to these new sky-born liberators. The sun was warm, the breeze was gentle, and everything seemed to fully validate the commander's optimistic prophecy. The troops formed up whistling and began their march toward the main objective, the great road bridge across the Rhine. Jeeps sped along country lanes, and soldiers even had the peace of mind to admire the windmills standing tall in the distance. But this pastoral atmosphere lasted less than an hour. The silence was abruptly broken by a sound that tore at the nerve. It was the distinctive, terrifying rate of fire of the MG-40 machine gun, known to the Allies as Hitler's Buzzsaw. As the lead reconnaissance platoon entered a wooded area near Roosterbeek, the gates of hell suddenly swung open for them. The lead jeep was turned into a sieve by a storm of metal, the windshield shattering before the driver could utter a sound. Immediately following the gunfire came a low, oppressive mechanical growl from the shadows of the trees. The ground began to tremble. A thick oak tree was pushed over as if it were at wing, and from the bushes, a massive steel monster slowly emerged. It was a Stern GE Schutz 3 assault gun. Behind it followed a squad of SS grenadiers clad in distinctive P-dot camouflage. Their movements were practiced and lethal. These were not raw recruits, but killing machines who had survived the Eastern Front. The disparity in firepower was brutally exposed. The British held Sten guns firing 9mm pistol rounds and Bren guns. Against the frontal armor of the assault gun, these weapons merely sparked harmlessly, failing to even scratch the paint. The German assault gun did not need to aim precisely, it simply fired a 75mm high-explosive shell into the center. A massive blast mixed with shrapnel threw soil high into the air. British soldiers attempted to fight back with the PIATs. It was a crude device, essentially a spring-loaded spigot mortar with a very short effective range. A corporal braved the hail. The shaped-charged warhead screamed out and struck the armor, but there was no penetrating explosion. It ricocheted harmlessly. The assault gun paused as if mocking the resistance before slowly rotating its gun muzzle toward the fragile defensive line. The dark muzzle pointed directly at the defensive line, and a second later, a massive ball of fire swallowed the entire position. This was the direct consequence of the intelligence failure. Light infantry against heavy armor was not a battle, but an execution. Meanwhile, at the Arnhem Road Bridge, the 2nd Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, had achieved a strategic miracle. Capitalizing on the initial German confusion and moving under darkness, they slipped through the blockade and seized the building. Their mission was to hold for 48 hours until armor arrived, but as the first light of dawn illuminated the Rhine River, they found themselves inside an iron trap. To the south was dead silence, while around them, the number of German groups increased. On the morning of September 18th, one of the most famous close-quarters battles of the entire war suddenly erupted. Captain Grebner, commander of the 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion under Knight's Cross Holder, decided to smash through. He led a column of 20 armored cars and half-racks, charging across the bridge at full throttle with engines roaring. The roar of engines shook the bridge deck as the steel Python spat machine gun fire, attempting to force its way through the blockade. Hidden in the houses overlooking the bridge, the British paratroopers held their breath. They waited until the first vehicle entered the kill zone. Then the order came, fire. Instantly, the bridge turned into a blazing inferno. Every weapon the British had opened up simultaneously. The lead armored car exploded, its burning wreckage blocking the path. The vehicles behind tried to turn but crashed into one another. It was a savage melee. British paratroopers threw grenades from second-story windows and fired submachine guns directly into the open half-track. Burning fuel flowed across the asphalt. Wounded German soldiers, engulfed in flames, screamed as they leapt into the Rhine River below. Captain Grebner was killed instantly, and his entire reconnaissance battalion was annihilated. The bridge was piled high with twisted burning steel. The British won that round, but this tactical victory only enraged the SS. Realizing that infantry charges failed, the Germans changed tactics. They brought in the true monsters, the Tiger tanks. By September 19th, the terrifying sound of tracks crushing cobblestones echoed. 56-ton Tiger tanks appeared, their massive 88mm cannons positioning themselves less than 20 meters from the window. The Germans stopped sending men and they decided simply to erase the buildings. The Tiger tanks did not need to hunt for snipers. They fired directly into the structural walls. With a deafening boom, entire facades pulverized into dust and flying debris. Bricks flew like shrapnel. Dust instantly sealed the airways. Before it could settle, the tank's machine guns swept the ruins. The British defensive perimeter was peeled away layer. Colonel Frost's headquarters in a basement became a living hell. There was no morphine and there were no bandages. Hundreds of wounded men lay on piles of coal, screaming in absolute agony. The air was thick with the stench of blood and burnt flesh. The most terrifying torture was not death, but the agonizing thirst. The water mains were severed on day one. Soldiers' lips cracked and bleed, their tongues swelled until they could not speak. To survive, they drank putrid water from flower vases, drained rusty coolant from radiators, and even crawled into toilets. Adding to the despair, the Germans brought up the Nebelwerfer, the 6-barreled rocket launcher known as Moaning Mini. When fired, it emitted a screech like a wailing ghost, followed by a blanket of fire. The street turned into a raging inferno. Paratroopers were forced to leap from burning buildings, only to be gunned down in mid-air by waiting German machine guns. Yet even in this absolute extremity, the paratroopers displayed breathtaking courage. Lieutenant Gray Byrne took his last grenade. With his shoulder blown open and one arm useless, he attempted to climb onto the rear deck of a German tank to jam the fence. Just as he was about to succeed, another tank's machine gun spotted him. A burst of heavy caliber bullets cut him down instantly. He fell beside the tracks, his hand still gripping the grenade with the pin unpulled. It was a tragic end to a brave soul. While the battle on the ground was bloody, the events in the sky were a tragedy. By the third day, the remnants were starved. Their only hope was resupply from the Royal Air Force. That afternoon, the drone of engines returned to the overcast sky. Sterling bombers and Dakota transports flew in through a wall of flak. On the ground, ignoring snipers, men rushed out. Paratroopers rushed into the open, laying out yellow marker panels and waving yellow smoke grenades to signal the pilots. But due to a total communications failure, the RAF did not know the British perimeter had shrunk to a tiny thumbprint. The pilots flew strictly to the plan, dropping supplies into pre-designated zones that were now firmly in German hands. The British soldiers on the ground watched helplessly as the canisters filled with food and ammunition drifted over their heads. The supplies landed just a few hundred meters away in the German lines, followed by the sickening sound of enemy cheering. The enemy soldiers opened the crates, ate the British beef, and loaded British bullets into captured guns to fire back at them. A young paratrooper collapsed in the mud, howling at the sky, crying not from fear, but from a crushing sense of betrayal. They had been forgotten, abandoned, and tossed into a meat grinder by their own commanders, who were miles away in safety. By the seventh day, the bridge was lost, the 2nd Battalion annihilated, and the remains were wrapped in a horseshoe shape. The Germans gave it a fitting name, Hexenkessel, the Witch Cauldron because they intended to boil the British alive inside. There was no front line anymore, the enemy was everywhere. The trees were draped with bodies and trunks were stripped by shrapnel. The Germans began the final liquidation, using self-propelled guns to blast the foxholes, one by one from a safe distance away. The British soldiers had not slept for days. Their eyes were hollow like walking corpses. Yet when the Germans charged, these ghost-like figures would still leap from their trenches roaring. When the bullets ran out, they used their bayonets. When the bayonets snapped, they used entrenching tools. When those were lost, they used their teeth and their helmets. In one skirmish, a one-armed British captain, who had lost a limb the day before, used his remaining hand to fire a revolver. He killed 3 German soldiers at point-blank range before he was finally obliterated by a sudden Ankh shell explosion. It was no longer about victory or even survival. It was about the final dignity of the elite paratrooper refusing to yield. Hundreds of miles away, Allied commanders still sipped tea over maps, hallucinating that the operation was still viable. On the night of September 25th, the order to retreat finally came. It was a command of utter cruelty to the men. Because the rescue boats were few and the crossing of the wide Rhine had to be done under the cover of darkness and rain. Only those who could walk could be evacuated. This meant that all the seriously wounded had to be left behind in the ruins. In the makeshift field hospitals of Oosterbeek, basements of shattered villas, one of the war's most heartbreaking scenes unfolded. Medical officers walked among the stretchers, whispering the truth to men with missing limbs and open wounds about the retreat. These soldiers knew what staying meant, captivity or death, but there was no panic, no begging, only a quiet acceptance of fate. A dying soldier struggled to pull a final cigarette from his pocket, handing it to the departing doctor with a shaking hand. "Take it, sir. If you make it back, tell my mum it did not hurt," as the doctor turned into the rainy night fighting back tears. The sound behind him was not weeping. The wounded men began to sing an absurd, cheerful tune, "Abide with me or we will meet again." The song echoed in the blood-soaked basement and the heavy tread of German jackboots appeared at the top of the dark stairs. The retreat at the riverbank was chaotic and desperate. The rain poured down in sheets, and the water was absolutely freezing. The Germans discovered the crossing and raked the surface of the river with machine gun fire and mortar shells through guys. The river turned reed. Countless soldiers, having survived 7 days of hell, died just yards from the safety of the far bank. When the dawn finally illuminated the Rhine, Operation Market Garden was over. Of the 10,000 elite soldiers who had landed, fewer than 2,400 made it back across the river. Nearly 8,000 of Britain's finest young men had vanished. Floating as lifeless forms under the bridge, registered as numbers in prisoner camps, or buried forever beneath the Dutch tulips. And what was the verdict on this sacrifice? It was encapsulated in a quote from Field Marshal Montgomery's post-war report. A sentence of chilling detachment. In my prejudiced view, if the operation is properly reviewed, it was 90% successful. 90% successful. Hidden in the shadow of that cold statistic were the desperate eyes of Major Urquhart and broken families. And the young lives that threw themselves against Tiger tanks with submachine guns. History favors the medals of generals. But in the ruins of Arnhem lies the ugliest truth of war. Arrogance is far more lethal than any bullet. Beneath those beautiful white parachutes lay the entrance to hell. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history as miscalculation, smash that like button and subscribe. I am your strategy observer.